Hilchos Tumas Meis, Perek Achad Asar, the laws of corpse impurity, chapter 11. In the context of graves that we've been discussing the last couple of days, the Rambam has told us that there are a number of rabbinic injunctions towards big pieces of land that we're supposed to treat essentially as impure with regards to corpses. When you have a field where you lost track of a grave, or you have a field where you plowed a grave, now the whole field becomes somewhat of a doubt. Perhaps there's some bones of impurity, and now you got to treat that whole place like as if it's totally corpse impure. Today we kind of go to another rabbinic injunction related to corpse impurity, which is actually much more wide-ranging, where the sages said that the entire diaspora, everywhere outside of Israel, is to be treated as somewhat impure with regards to corpses. And it has to do with, as we'll soon see and we'll explore in a little bit of detail, but definitely at a basic level, it has to do with the fact that Gentiles were careless about what they did with their dead. And so you can walk outside of Israel and basically anywhere be bumping into or be on top of a corpse, which is going to lead actually to another conversation at the end of the chapter about places in Israel where we know that Gentiles used to live. They made this their homes, a family area. There are many laws that relate to corpse impurity imposed by the rabbis on such locations. Also for the same reason, the fact that Goyim didn't care so much exactly how they treated their dead, where they buried them, and therefore this caused problems for Jewish people who are trying to be careful from corpse impurity, that there may be basically just corpses everywhere. So we're going to discuss these two rabbinic injunctions, one on all of the diaspora, and one on in Israel, places where Gentiles used to live. The diaspora part itself, the Rambam is going to divide into two, because there was two stages in the decree imposed by the rabbis, as we're going to see. One has to do with the actual land, the earth of the diaspora, and one has to do with the airspace. Just being in the airspace of the diaspora, let's say even if you can fly, which leads to today, with planes and everything. Even if you can fly over the airspace, just being in the airspace also makes you impure, and there's a discussion on that as to why that is, or what's the driving force behind that imposition, which we're going to discuss also at length. So the Rambam begins talking about the issue of the diaspora. Eretz ha'amim, halacha aleph, the land of the nations, which again means anywhere outside of Israel, the sages looked at as impure with regards to corpse impurity, but in two parts. Betchila gazru al gusha bilvat. In the beginning, the sages decreed on it just on its earth. Kebeis hapras. They treated it like what we learned yesterday, the area, a field where in Israel where you plowed over a grave and now maybe the bones might be everywhere. So the sages said, look at the entirety of the diaspora as a beis hapras, and don't go in there. And if you do, consider yourself corpse impure. Now, because it was like a beis hapras, v'lo hayu metamim ela hamahalech ba, they would only therefore declare impure somebody who actually walked on the earth of the diaspora. And even that, as the commentaries say, you would have to do it in a way where it would make you impure had it been a beis hapras. Remember yesterday we had at the end of the chapter different ways. If you walk on tough rock, or you ride on somebody. In some cases, if you're not considered to be the one moving the ground of the beis hapras, you don't become impure. So in the same way, when it comes to Eretz ha'amim, the diaspora, there was the same equal decree level. That if you walked in it in such a way where you knew you were definitely moving the ground, then you would become impure. Or if you actually touched or you actually carried, some of it's dirt. That was the initial decree, only on the actual land mass of the diaspora. Chazru, later on, the sages came back, the gazru alavira sheyetame, and they made a decree that simply the airspace, just what's called avir eretz ha'amim, the airspace of the land of the nations makes you impure. V'afal pisha leinaga v'lei nasa, even though you didn't touch it, even though you didn't carry it. Alakevan shehichnis reishei verdubai la'avir eretz ha'amim. Once you put your head and most of your body into the airspace of the land of the nations, nitma, you become impure. Not only people, v'chein kli cheres, so too pottery utensils, whose impurity is always guided by their airspace. Shehichnis avira le'eretz ha'amim. If you bring in its airspace to the land of the diaspora, even if you don't put in most of it, as the commentaries say. When it's a person, you got to come in mostly. When it's a kli cheres, since it's all about the opening to it, so as long as you put in the opening and now its airspace is open to the airspace of the diaspora, it becomes impure. Ushar kelim shehichnis rubam la'avir eretz ha'amim. Other utensils, here that Rambam goes back to the majority, putting the majority into the airspace of the land of the nations, nitmu, it becomes impure. And there's some significant discussion in the commentaries as to what is the nature of the impurity of the airspace of the diaspora. Why or under what rubric did the sages declare this impurity? The two primary opinions on this are the Lechem Mishnah Also, the Merkevas HaMishnah mentions this, and the Mishnah Lemelech. And we're going to see that this difference here is going to express itself in multiple places throughout this chapter. The Lechem Mishnah says, there's something inherent about the airspace of the diaspora which the sages wanted you to keep away from. Perhaps it was because they wanted to discourage Jews from leaving Israel. So they simply said, just being in the airspace is unholy airspace, we're going to equate it with becoming corpse impure. Something about the air. The Mishnah Lamelech says no. The airspace impurity was an extension of the earth impurity. And it has to do with basically the principle of oyhel. When it comes to a corpse, if you form a tent over a corpse, you cover actual corpse flesh, you've made an oil over it, you become impure. When it comes to the land of the diaspora, so it's true, we don't know for sure, it's obviously not actual corpse flesh, but the rabbis basically treated a person going into the airspace as now forming an oyhel, forming a tent over the earth of the diaspora, and because of that element of oyel, that's why you become impure. Granted, it doesn't have all the stringencies of oyel, as we'll soon see in a moment. In general, the whole idea of oil doesn't apply to it in the regular way that oil would apply to other corpse entities. But the fundamental understanding or definition of the impurity of airspace is because you are, by being in the airspace, essentially forming a covering over the earth of Eretz Amim. Therefore, even if you levitated, even if somehow you can just be detached from the earth, the fact that you're in the airspace covering the earth makes you impure. And again, just to stress, this is not by any means like regular oil. Regular oil, just you put your hand over corpse flesh, you're completely impure. Just you put your hand into a tent that has a corpse in it, you're completely impure. Here the Rambam's talking about actually going in. You have to go in fully, at least most of your body. So again, it's not the same level as oil, but the principle is the principle of oil. And we're going to see again, it's going to come out a bunch of times, this argument in the Lechem Mishnah and the Mishnah Lemelech. And now the Rambam gives us this caveat. Tumas halacha beis. Tumas avir eretz ha'amim loy asu oisa ketumas afara. The level of impurity imposed by the airspace of the diaspora is not like, the sages did not make it like the impurity of the earth. Elakalahi mimena, it's lighter. Lighter and specifically in three ways. Shal tumas afara, surfin tumas v'kadashim. Impurity transmitted through the earth of the diaspora would cause one to actually burn holy foods. Truma and sacrificial meat, if they came into contact with the earth of the diaspora, they would actually be burnt. Totally disqualified. Which is a sign of higher level impurity. The hamistame begusha, if a person becomes impure by touching the earth, tame tumas shiva, he's impure for 7 days, like touching highest level corpse. Also has to be sprinkled by the ashes of the red heifer on the 3rd and 7th day, as we'll discuss at length in the next set of laws. That's the way you become pure from corpse impurity, by getting sprinkled by the water and the ashes of the parah aduma. Becoming impure from the earth, the actual earth of Eretz HaAmim, is that strict, it requires hazaya. But if somebody becomes impure via the airspace, doesn't require this extreme sprinkling of the water and ash of the red heifer 3rd and 7th days. Ela tvila v'hed of shemesh, simply goes to the mikveh and waits till sundown. It's a 1-day impurity and that's it. V'chein truma v'kadashim shenitmu machmas avira. Also, if you have truma and sacrificial meat that became impure from the airspace, toilin, we do what's called toilin. Toilin means you put it, you hang it in doubt. Lo eichlin v'lo yisarfin. We don't eat it, but we're not going to burn it. It's not totally impure. So here you see in different ways that there's a lightness or a leniency in terms of the impurity communicated by the airspace versus the impurity communicated by the landmass. Halacha gimel, afar eretz ha'amim, va'afar beis hapras, returning to the earth for a second, the earth of the diaspora, and also the earth of the beis hapras, which we discussed yesterday, mitamin b'mago v'masa k'mesha b'yarnu. They communicate impurity by touching and by carrying, as we explained. But while we've said the types of impurity that they convey, we haven't spoken about amounts. When it comes to the corpse itself, the volume was always a kazayas, was always an olive-sized portion. When it comes to this dirt, it says that I'm a bit of a different amount. V'kama shi'uran, how much is a significant amount of earth to be able to communicate the impurity? K'chaysam hamartzufin. K'chaysam hamartzufin means the thick or the sticky mud they used to use to seal sacks. Rambam writes elsewhere in his commentary to the Mishnah, people that were traveling used to put their clothing in these sacks, they would seal it with this sticky mud. Or merchants who had a lot of money, they would put it in their sacks and they would seal it with this mud. It was a common practice. So the Rambam uses that as just like your indicator. People knew how much this amount was. However much mud you use to seal these sacks, That's how much earth of the diaspora, Beis HaPras, would communicate impurity. Another way to define the size, v'hu kepika gedola shel sakoyin. It's like the large, what's called a whorl, at the bottom of a spindle used for spinning the thick thread that was made in sack. Sakoyin has to do with sack. This is more of an ancient thing, but if you look, you could find this on YouTube even today. The way they used to spin thread is you hang a bunch of thread, or the fiber, the thick felt, whatever it is, on the hook of the spindle. And then by this whorl on the bottom was like a weight that would allow the spinning to happen properly and for the threads to separate and become thin as you have to do it. It's hard to describe it over here, but basically look up on YouTube, spinning with a whorl, and you'll see exactly how this was done. Sometimes they have a whorl at the top. In other cases, they have it at the bottom as a weight. That's what the Rambam is referring to. Now, the bigger or the thicker the thread you want, the bigger the whorl has to be. So the Rambam says here, we're talking about the whorl that was used by the sack spinners, the ones who used to make the sackcloth, that thick, it's like a thicker thread. So that ball at the end of the spindle, that was the size of earth that would communicate impurity. Afar Beis HaPras v'afar chutz ha'aretz shabab b'yarak. Says the Rambam, consider the common case of earth from a Beis HaPras, or earth from the outside of Israel that would come together with vegetables. Pick fresh vegetables out of the ground. Now the vegetables are carrying earth. So does this earth communicate impurity if you brought it from outside of Israel, you brought it from Beis HaPras into the Israeli market? Says the Rambam, it's not a combinations game. If in one location you have enough earth that equals to the amount of mud used to seal the sacks, mitame, then that clod of earth communicates impurity. But if not, all the earth does not combine. As we saw yesterday, the sages only impose their impurity on earth in its natural state. This principle was also said yesterday when it came to the Beis HaPras. The idea is that it's only the way the earth is naturally that communicates impurity. It's not combining it, bringing different places. That's not the impurity. The Rambam shows that this was actually kept in practice with a story. Meis, there was a story, shahayu igreis bois michutz la'aretz livnei koyanim gedolim. People were sending letters to the sons of high priests, which is people that have to be very careful with their state of impurity. And these letters were coming from outside of Israel, and they were sealed like letters were sealed using mud or earth. V'hayu bahen kisa'ah ukisasayim chaysamis. If you would count, if you combine all the earth used as the seals, there would be enough volume of a sa'ah, or two sa'ah. Commentators on the Mishnah say that, one time it was a sa'ah, different time it was two sa'ah. Point is, it was always a lot of quantity. But because it was not at any one letter or at any one place, there wasn't enough mud on its own, these high priest's sons did not treat it with any level of impurity, because there was no individual seal that had enough earth like the amount that was used to seal a sack. Hey, you want to put it all together? Fine, but we don't put it together. The impurity is only in its natural state. This is not in its natural state. By the way, the Mishnah Lamelech writes that this law, that dirt in the vegetables has to be one unit, applies even if a person would be able to touch at one time multiple parts of the earth, and he would in effect be touching enough earth to make up the size of Chesam Martzufin. As long as it's not all in one place, it's not a gush kibriyasei, he's still pure. Halacha dalid hamevi tanurim usfalim uklei cheres michutz haaretz. What if somebody brings pottery or clay utensils, clay ovens, clay bowls, other types of pottery utensils from outside of Israel? Essentially, since these are made from earth, you've just brought into Israel earth from the diaspora. Who cares that it took on a form of a utensil? What is the status of the earth? So the Rambam says, it depends at which point they are. Ad shaloi husku, if they have not yet been fired. When you made a clay utensil, first you form it, then you fire it in a kiln. So if they were not yet fired, they're literally still earth in effect. Tmeim mishum eretz ha'amim. They are impure on account of being land of the diaspora. They're treated like actual land, like actual earth, totally impure. Misha husku, if however, here's how the commentaries explain it, if they were already fired outside of Israel, in other words, you brought them into Israel after they were already fired outside of Israel, so then, tmeim mishum kli cheres shenitma be'eretz ha'amim. They're impure, but on a lower level. You can't call them the actual earth of the diaspora, but it's like taking a pottery utensil and exposing it to the airspace of the diaspora, which would make the klicheres what's called a rishon latuma, first degree impurity. Because if you remember a couple chapters ago, the Rambam said that a pottery utensil, chapter 5, pottery utensil can never become an avhatuma, can never become a primary source of impurity. So it becomes a lower level of impurity, which cannot further transmit the impurity to people or to utensils, as we explained in chapter 5, but the point is it becomes impure like any pottery utensil would become impure. Now, the commentaries add, I think it's the Mishnah Lamelech, that if you took it into Israel, and then you fired it in a kiln in Israel, now you've totally converted the status, and now it's completely pure. Interesting thing to point out. Halacha hey, let's see how far the decree of Eretz Ha'amim's impurity went. If you think about it, the underlying svara, the underlying reasoning for making this impurity is because we're not sure perhaps there's a corpse anywhere in the land. But what if you're walking in a place in the diaspora where there cannot be corpses? A person is walking in the lands of the diaspora, in mountainous regions, in rocky terrain. No one's going to bury there. Doesn't matter. Tamei Tumas Shiva. You're still impure with the highest level of impurity, 7 days. We have what's called loy plug. Sages never differentiate. If they make a decree and it applies in one place, they extend it fully to all places, even if the logic doesn't apply. Bayam, what if you're walking in the area of the sea, or the place where the sea arises in its wrath? That means the tidal area, where the tide covers the beach. So here, says the Rambam, interesting thing, Taher mishum negeya be'eretz ha'amim, a person standing there or touching the earth. We can't call you impure for touching diaspora land. You're pure on account of the afar eretz ha'amim, v'tamei mishum avira. But since you're in the airspace, you are still impure. And now here we have to return to the Lechem Mishnah and the Mishnah Lamelech's argument about the nature of the airspace impurity. If the impurity is essential to the airspace, like the Lechem Mishnah said, so it's very understandable. The Rambam is basically saying that if you're standing in the sea area, nobody was buried there, so there's no issue of corpses, but you're still in the airspace, which is a separate decree, just the airspace itself communicates impurity, so you're still impure. But if, as the Mishnah Lamelech says, the whole impurity of airspace is an extension of the impurity of the earth, so if you're in a situation where the earth is not communicating impurity, neither should the airspace. Very big question. The Mishnah Lamelech writes in this Rambam, V'tzarich iyun. It requires analysis. He doesn't understand the Rambam. He says if the Rambam is true, that the Eretz Ha'amim has to do with, that the Avir Eretz Ha'amim has to do with the actual Eretz Ha'amim, this cannot be possible. Now there is a commentary who answers, commentary on the Mishnah, but he explains the Rambam here as well. He says that no. The reason why in this specific case, the earth is not going to communicate impurity is because the tidal waves are running over this space back and forth all the time. So there's no way that the earth that you're standing on is accessing part of a corpse. But it's still very much possible that down deep in the earth, down below where you're standing, below what you're touching, there are corpses buried. And for that, being in the airspace, creating an oihel over the part that's underground, because oil doesn't make a difference if it's surface level or underground. If you're making an oil, you're making an oil. So since you're making an oil for what's underground, so we can hold you accountable, hold you impure for the Avir Eretz Ha'amim. You're still being mahil on improper land, even though you may not be touching it, because on the surface, all the corpse elements have been washed away. Interesting perspective. The Rambam continues, Hanichnas la'eretz ha'amim, if somebody enters the land of the diaspora, b'shida teva u'migdal, in a chest or a box or a cabinet, hapirchin ba'avir, that are flying in the air. Now even though this sounds like airplanes before airplanes, maybe this is the box flying in the air, the commentaries actually say it means that you're not touching the ground. You may be being carried by a person or by an animal. Some say even if you're being dragged along, but you never come to rest in this box on the earth. And it leads to a big discussion about airplanes, because airplanes are actually pareach ba'avir. But here, the simple meaning is simply you're in the air, so to speak, suspended, not directly touching the ground. Says the Rambam, nevertheless tamei, you're impure. And he gives an interesting reason. She'oihel zaruk einoi karoi oihel. because a tent that's thrown up in the air, that's suspended, is not called a tent. We can't call you being in a structure. Essentially, you're touching the ground. Now, here we go back to the Lechem Mishnah, Mishnah Melech argument. Lechem Mishnah writes over here that obviously the Rambam is talking about a case where the chest or the box or the cabinet is completely sealed from all sides. Because otherwise, who cares about the reason of oil zaruk not being an oil or not? You're in the airspace, you're exposed to the airspace of the diaspora. And that itself, in the Lechem Mishnah's view, just being exposed to the airspace essentially makes you impure. Whereas the Mishnah Melech writes, no. It doesn't have to be that it's sealed from all sides. As long as there's something intervening between you and the ground, you're no longer being ma'ahil. You're no longer making an oil directly over the earth of the diaspora. That's enough not to make you impure because of Avi Eretz Ha'amim. And therefore, that Rambam has to say, She'oil Zarok Ein Oil, the reason is because of the fact that there's a tent in midair is not enough to be a tent. So here we see another expression as machlekes between the Mishnah Melech and the Lechem Mishnah, how it matters how you explain it, and it'll have ramifications in explaining this Rambam as well. Halacha Vav, Surya. What about the area that we've encountered a few times? I didn't get it on the map properly, but basically there's an extension out of the northern part of Israel, which King David conquered. It wasn't fully considered like Israel, but it wasn't fully considered like a diaspora. Many areas that's considered like Israel, certain tithes have to be taken from there, as we saw in the Rambam 7th book. So what's the status over here with regards to the earth of the diaspora? It says the Rambam, Surya, Afara, Tamei, Kechutz Haaretz. We keep one and we discard one. The earth, the actual land mass, is impure like the diaspora. Va'avira tar, lo'gazur al avira. The airspace is pure. The rabbis didn't impose the decree on the airspace. Lefichach, therefore, im hoisa smucha le'eretz Yisrael, safa b'safa, if you're in a part of Syria, which directly is parallel to the border of Israel, because Syria extends further, but let's say you're on the border where it's step on one side you're in Israel, step on the other side you're in Syria, and nothing was dividing between them. Not diaspora land, not a cemetery, not a beis hapras, a doubtful area where the grave was plowed. Technically, you could enter Syria and stay pure. If you came in a box or a cabinet or a chest, so long as you don't touch the earth, because only the earth is impure, not the airspace. Same thing, diaspora. If it's right next to the border of Israel, you can't go in because of the airspace itself will make you impure, but you could do something that will allow you to go in. If there's no space in between that's impure, you can check the earth like you would check a beis hapras, like we saw yesterday, and that'll make it pure. And because the airspace is an extension of the earth impurity, so the airspace also will not make you impure. This is a little bit of a problem for the Lechem Mishnah. See there how he explains it. I should point out that the Ravid, primary commentator here, says that the Rambam is a little bit mistaken here. If you look in the Talmud, this is not talking about any part of the diaspora. It's talking only about the parts of the diaspora that are surrounded by three sides by Israeli land. It's called Muvlois. We'll have it in the end of the chapter today. But the Rambam writes, no, it applies to all diaspora land that's exactly on the border, flush with the border of Israel. Halacha Zayin, talking about Eretz Ha'amim, now we move into Israel, and we talk about what's called Midoir HaGoyim, living quarters of Gentiles. In Israel, also has a level of impurity. Halacha Zayin, Makim Sheshachnu Bay Oivde Kechavim Be'eretz Yisrael, a place which everybody knew, a little neighborhood. This is where Gentiles lived in Israel. Hareza Mitame Ke'eretz Ha'amim Adji Ibadek. It communicates impurity like the land of the diaspora, full level, the airspace, the earth, until it's checked. Shema Kovru by Nefalim, because maybe they buried their fetuses. Ram doesn't say corpses, because corpses weren't buried in homes, even by the Gentiles. But maybe fetuses were buried there. And for Jewish people, that communicates impurity, corpse impurity. So the whole compound, the whole area is considered to be impure. Halacha Ches u'truma b'kadashin. Shenitmu machmas medera ivde kechavim. Any sacrificial meat or truma foods that became impure because of contact with the residential quarters of Gentiles, toilin would be left to hang. Lo oichlin v'lo surfin. We do not eat them, we do not burn them, just like when it came to the Tuma of Avir, Eretz Ha'amim, the airspace. Here, even if they come into contact with the earth of the quarters, since the whole Tuma was imposed out of doubt, so we keep it out of doubt. The Kama Yishu B'Makayim B'Yitzarich B'Dika. How long must the Gentiles live there? And now it's required to be checked. Not when they move in, obviously. In other words, how much time do we have to elapse to assume maybe there was a fetus buried there? Arba'im Yoim. Says the Rambam 40 days. Kedisha Tis'aber Isha V'Tapil Neifel Shemetame. Enough time to have a woman become pregnant and miscarry a fetus, which is old enough to communicate impurity. Because the first 40 days, a fetus doesn't communicate impurity. So you got to give it 40 days to become somewhat developed. Now, truth is, the argument could be made. Maybe the woman moved in pregnant, but we don't worry for that. We only worry if a conception could have been created from the beginning and 40 days would have passed. Afilu ish she'eni ma'isha. Even if it's a man who lives there without a woman. If he lives there for 40 days, his living quarters become impure till it's checked. Gzeida, the rabbis decreed in this case, mishum madar shetiyah ba'isha, because of the case where there will be a woman. Even though in this specific case, the reason doesn't apply. But again, loy plug, we don't differentiate. Afilu eved v'sardis, even a slave or an impotent man, a isha or a woman living alone, a katan ben tesha shanim v'yem echad, or a 9-year-old child, oisem medoira if the kechavim creates the status of Gentile living quarters. They live there 40 days, it's a problem. Now, the woman herself obviously is a problem. As the Kesef Mishnah points out, what's the Rambam coming to teach us? But he doesn't give an answer. Point is, the Rambam is just saying, even if a woman lives alone, no man around, still 40 days later, it's a problem. Halacha tes, medoira if the kechavim, shahaya by eved mi Yisrael. What if there was a non-Jewish living quarter which had a Jewish slave? Now, doesn't mean an actual Jewish slave. The commentaries say it means an Evet Knani. He was a Canaanite slave, but he belonged to a Jew. Or Isha, a Katan ben Tesha, or there was a woman there, or there was a 9-year-old child there. They're standing guard that nobody buries fetuses there. Then indeed, it doesn't need to have a checking going on before Jews enter there. Which parts of the quarters must be checked? Now, as the commentators explain, obviously you got to check the whole thing. The Rambam is saying here, what has to be checked really well? Most of it could be checked, cursory check, regular check. But there are certain parts that have to be checked by digging and actual real searching. And that is as habivin ha'amukim, the deep pipes that were used as drain pipes. As hamayim hasruchin, and the area of the dirty waters, the sewage waters, because they could just throw things in there. And these are the parts that you have to go, extra special search. Any place which a pig or a weasel could access and remove a fetus from there, doesn't require checking, because they will drag it away from there. If you have living quarters of Gentiles that actually now lays in ruins, even though animals could come there and take away stuff, it remains impure until it's checked. Halacha vav ha'itz devaniyos. Itz devaniyos, he translates here as a covered walkway. The Alter Rebbe and Shulchan Aruch described what we have today also in many places, that in front of shops, there was a part of the public domain. It was for sure recognized as the street, but it was somewhat covered. It was like a little bit of a walkway in front of the shops. So it's part of the public domain, but it's clearly demarcated, even though there's no actual walls. As you see over here, it's part of the public area, but it's clearly marked off. Ein bahen mishum mederev de kechavim. If you have this place where, near where Gentiles lived, that area is not problematic on account of non-Jewish residents. Lefisha higluya ve'ein ba makayim lahat min hanefalim, because it's open. There's no closed space where they could hide a fetus. And indeed, va'asara mekayimais ein bahem mishum mederev de kechavim. There are 10 places which are never treated with a problem of non-Jewish living residences. Lefisha indirasan kvua legazur alein tuma, because the living quarters or the residential aspect of these places is not permanent, so there's no impurity. What are the 10 places? The Arab Bedouin tents that were used while traveling. It's not a permanent structure. The Hasukos, huts that were made for people that would guard fruit or guard orchards. The Hatzrifin, huts with pointed roofs, were not meant to last for a long time. The haburganim, storage, little storage units, where they would keep grain or different fruits in the shade. The hatikra shal gabi ha'amudim ve'ein lo tfanes, a roof placed over pillars with no walls, ve'hein bate hakayetz, also known as summer huts, summer homes. Basically just a lot of air coming in. They would sit there in the summer, like a gazebo of some type. Ubeis shar, a gateway. Many times coming into a compound, there was a walkway which was enclosed somewhat where a guard could stand guard, and it could be somewhat of a living quarter, but it is not a permanent living quarter. Va'avira shel chatzer, the airspace of a courtyard. And here, the Rambam says we're talking about a case where the house that's adjacent to the courtyard is not being used for residence at all. Only the courtyard is being used for residence. That's where there is no worry. The hamerchat, and a bathhouse. Umakim sha'isen by hachitzim muklei al mulchama, the weapons factory, the munitions factory, where they make the arrows and the weapons. Umakim aligyoinais, and the army bases. Nothing over here is permanent residence, so there's no worry once they leave that maybe there's some dead fetuses or something like that over here. A shop does not have the problem of a non-Jewish residence unless he actually lived there. If you have a courtyard which is considered impure on account of non-Jewish residence, which is a case where the adjacent home is used for residence, and then even the courtyard is also problematic, says the Rambam had a beis shar shalah, its gateway entrance, va'avira, and its airspace, tmein kamaya, are impure like it. And now the Rambam says, ve'ein medoira iv dekechavim, v'lei beis hapras b'chutz al haaretz. The laws of non-Jewish residences and beis hapras do not apply in the diaspora. Now, even though this sounds like a leniency, and there are some ways to explain it that way, but the classic interpretation of this line is a stringency. The Rambam is saying, this whole thing doesn't even begin in the diaspora because the whole diaspora is impure already, both its airspace and its earth, on account of being Eretz Ha'am in the diaspora. Halacha Yud Bey is Ayaris HaMuvlais B'Eretz Yisrael. Certain lands that are swallowed, again, surrounded on three sides by Israel. Sisis v'chavrei seha, Ashkelon v'chavrei seha. The Rambam gives two examples, Sisis and Ashkelon and their suburbs. Even though they're considered in the diaspora in the element that they are exempt from tithes and Shemitah, the sabbatical year, they're not treated like a diaspora with regards to this Tuma. They're considered to be like part of Israel almost. They're surrounded on three sides. It's also a lesson that, if you make yourself an Israeli sacred space, an Israel space, a holy space, it can consume even unholy spaces and transform them to holiness. Similarly, the cheskas drachim shall oilei bavel tahirus, the presumption of the pathways used by those who came up from Babylon to Israel are pure. Afal pishein muvlois be'eretz ha'amim, even though they're fully surrounded by non-Jewish land. But because they're meant as pathways to go to Israel, the fact that their ultimate destination is Israel, that makes them all pure, even from the outset within Babylon, which was totally impure. Another powerful lesson. As long as you're looking towards Israel, so to speak, as long as you have your goal, your eyes set on something holy, the whole pathway to get there also becomes imbued with the holiness.